As we wrap up the Commonwealth of Virginia's prosecution case against Doctor Marshall Benton Taylor, the defense gets set to put on their case. In our last video, we covered and summarized the testimonies of William Bud Gillum, his son Milburn Gillum, and Joe Perkins. These three men all testified to a conversation the three had with Taylor a week before the killings. The men testified that they had talked about a shooting in the bed of Ira Mullins. This event had happened on April 4th, and Taylor had told them he knew all about it, even though he had been in Kentucky at that time. When asked about how he knew, Taylor had replied, "The spirits had told him." But Dr. Taylor had also told him that Ira Mullins had offered $200 to Doc Mullins to kill him. These testimonies seem to corroborate the testimony of John Branham, who testified that on Thursday after the killings, Taylor had been on the way to Wise Courthouse to meet Doc Mullins, and that Taylor had told him that Doc was going to swear out an affidavit that Ira had tried to hire him to assassinate Taylor. The Commonwealth of Virginia's prosecution witnesses in summary. We also summarized the testimonies of May Branham, Logan Nottingham, and George E. Robertson. May and Logan had given testimony that on the Sunday night before the massacre, they had seen Dr. Taylor and another man, who May identified as Cal Fleming, riding towards the Pound Gap in Kentucky. May Branham further testifies that she seen Taylor on Thursday after the massacre going towards Pound, which also corroborates John Branham's testimony. She goes on to say that Dr. Taylor and Cal Fleming had come to her house sometime after that, but neither of them had talked about the killings. George E. Robertson would testify that he had seen Dr. Taylor at his house 2 weeks before the massacre. He would say that Taylor had been staying with Aunt Ellen Alley during that time in question, which corroborates her later testimony of the same thing. Robertson would go on to say that Taylor had come to his house several times after the killings. George would end his testimony by stating that he had never heard Taylor make any declarations about killing Mullins. Also, in our last video, we summarized the testimony of John Venters, but we went into a little more detail on his testimony because of the changes in recording style in the transcript that we believe indicates that it may have been edited. Venters would testify that on about May 24th, he had sought out Dr. Taylor to treat a sick child, and that he had done so even though he had heard about the massacre, and by that time he had probably heard the rumors about Taylor as well. John then testifies that Dr. Taylor had returned to his house to see the sick child several days later. It is here that the transcript records the most unique testimony about Dr. Taylor's rifle. Every other time the rifle is said to be a 45 by 75 using only numbers, but here the phrase is spelled out as 45-75 using no numbers. He would also be asked about the guns that the Fleming brothers had been carrying. The answer he gives about them is recorded in the same fashion. The abnormality of Venters' testimony for the prosecution. We freely admit in the transcript's prosecution examination phase of the testimony of John Venters, we could find no evidence of editing. But there are several abnormalities that stand out during the cross-examination by the defense. Bear in mind that Taylor's rifle had not yet been entered into evidence. Venters is asked by the defense about a type of rifle and who owns one. He replies that Henry Adams, James Potter, and Howard Little owned a 44 by 75 rifle. At the time of the trial, this rifle did not exist, but the 1873 44 by 40 rifle did exist in both rimfire and centerfire models. We know from the often told tale that the affidavit of I.N. Mills that the ammunition found at the crime scene was indeed a rimfire version of the 44 caliber rifle. This ammunition would indeed fit Dr. Taylor's rifle, but it would have to be hand-loaded and would have struck the shell just off center, again as we are told by the often-told story and the affidavit of Mr. Mills. Therefore, in this instance, we think that the cross-examination of John Venters has been altered. We think that the 44 by 40 was changed to 44 by 45. We also found it highly suspicious that Mr. Venters was asked where everyone he named was owning a similar rifle lived, except for James Potter, a man whose name appears over and over in this trial and in the oft-told story. The testimonies of Filmore Addington and John B. Mullins. Filmore Addington would testify that on the Friday after the massacre, he would see Dr. Taylor talking with his neighbor, Whit Marshall. He states that the Fleming brothers had been with him and that they had come through the woods and spoken with Marshall by his fence. The next is a little confusing, as Addington states that when he saw Taylor talking to Marshall the next week, Taylor had said not to talk too loud. Addington finishes up his testimony by stating that before the killing, he had never heard Taylor make any declarations against Ira Mullins. John B. Mullins would testify about a conversation he had with Taylor in March of that year. They had been talking about a recent shooting that had happened at Bow Camp in Powell, Virginia. He goes on to say that Taylor said, quote, "It was nothing that would be," unquote. He said that Taylor had said, quote, that they had moved over to the pound and he looked to be killed every day, unquote. Mullins would go on to testify that Taylor had not said anything about Ira Mullins, but he, Mullins, thought that Ira had just moved to the pound. Mullins would then testify that the shooting that they had talked about at the time was, quote, just in fun, unquote, and that Ed Hall, a deputy sheriff, had just moved to the pound. The testimony of W. B. Renfro. The testimony of W. B. Renfro is unique for three reasons. He was a deputy sheriff after Taylor's arrest. He and another deputy had brought Dr. Taylor back to Gladeville to stand trial. He was the first witness to testify to the whereabouts of Dr. Taylor's rifle. Although R.M. and D.O. Baldwin would identify Dr. Taylor in Bluefield, West Virginia, they could not make an arrest. This was because, although an indictment had been issued, there was no warrant for his arrest. The Baldwins had then notified the sheriff of Giles County, Virginia, of Taylor's presence. The sheriff of Giles County responded by sending Deputy Mouchon to Bluefield. Mouchon arrived just as Taylor was boarding a southbound train heading back into Virginia. Mouchon and the Baldwins boarded the same train and kept Taylor under surveillance until they arrived in Pearisburg, Virginia. Deputy Mouchon then arrested Taylor and held him until an arrest warrant could be obtained from a judge in Giles County. Taylor was then remanded into custody of the Baldwins, who boarded another train heading to Norton, Virginia. Taylor and one of the Baldwins would exit the train in Tazewell, Virginia, while the other Baldwin continued to Wise County to collect a private bounty that had been offered for Taylor's arrest. We have no idea who issued the bounty, how much it was, or if it was ever paid to the Baldwin Detective Agency. Deputy Renfro testified that he had not seen Dr. Taylor after the killing, but that he and Deputy White had been sent to Tazewell to bring Taylor back to Wise County. This testimony dispels the rumor about an arrest in Norton or that the Baldwins had returned him to Norton. Renfro testifies that Dr. Taylor had told them that if he had not been caught, he would have been in Florida that day. Renfro is then asked something about a gun. When Taylor was arrested, he had had his twin Colt .45 pistols. But Hilton responds by telling the court that he thought that the jail guard, George Hilton, was using a .45 by .75, and he had thought that that rifle belonged to Dr. Taylor. At this point, we must point out that the rifle was not part of the evidence in this case, and that it would not be entered into evidence until the last witness for the defense testifies that he had shot the gun during the trial. The testimony of William Mullins. William Mullins would be the final witness that Prosecutor Bruce would call to the stand while trying to build his case. His testimony is hard to follow and once again highlights the disadvantages that we and the appellate court would have by not knowing exactly what the witness was asked. But we shall try to make sense of the testimony. Mullins stated that Dr. Taylor had said, quote, "If I ever get in a row with another wagon, I'll shoot the horses first, and I'll get what is in that wagon," unquote. Mullins then says that Taylor had not stated who he was talking about, but he thought it had to do with the shootout that Dr. Taylor and Ira Mullins had in Gladeville. Another note here is that it's probably this testimony where the folk tale about this shootout being the one that had left Ira a quadriplegic comes from. William goes on to testify that Jarvie Candale had given him a message to give to Dr. Taylor. The message is that Ira and Henderson Mullins, along with someone named Palter, had gone to North Carolina for a load of whiskey. To unscramble this testimony, we think that the conversation and the statement about the shooting of the horses was a result of the message from Candale. William Mullins would further testify that Candale had also said that Candale would let Taylor know when Mullins' party would return from North Carolina with the whiskey. William would go on to state that Taylor had not told him if he would try to catch Ira and Henderson, but would say that he saw Taylor later and that at the time Taylor had told him that he had seen Jarvie Candale. William goes on to say that Taylor had said that he and Jeff Mullins had watched Mullins' house in Kentucky day and night, waiting for Ira and Henderson to return. On cross-examination, William Mullins would testify that Dr. Taylor was a United States Marshal at the time when he carried the message from Jarvie Candale. He would also testify that he was with Dr. Taylor when the news came from North Carolina that Ira Mullins had been killed. William testified that when the news had come, that Dr. Taylor had said, quote, "Thank God for that. I was never as glad of anything in my life," unquote. William Mullins would finish up his testimony by admitting that this conversation had taken place nearly 2 years prior. He would also state that Ira had a reputation for dealing in liquor prior to now, and that some people had said that Ira had a U.S. license to do so. The prosecution for the Commonwealth of Virginia now rests its case. The defense team for Dr. Taylor will now put on its witnesses in our next section of the story. We at Kentucky Tennessee Living would like to thank you for watching our series on the Killing Rock. Don't forget to hit that like button, as the more likes we receive, the more likely YouTube is to suggest our videos to other viewers. Also, to receive a notice when we upload a new video, be sure to subscribe and click the bell for notifications. We thank you for continuing to support Kentucky Tennessee Living as we bring to you the history of the Appalachian Mountains. We remind everyone that the story names Killing Rock, the Oft-Told Tale, Killing Rock, the Untold Story, and Killing Rock, the Trial are all under the Kentucky Tennessee Living copyrights.